Good evening, and welcome back to Midnight Murder and Mystery, where true crime and unexplained mysteries are told in the dark. Tonight's episode explores 3 chilling cases of people who went missing without a trace. No answers, no suspects, just unanswered questions that still haunt those left behind. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and settle in for tonight's Missing Without a Trace True Stories. Our first story is a strange cold case that very recently has begun moving again after 35 years. Let's head to Michigan and take a closer look at what happened the afternoon Paige Renkoski disappeared. Paige was 30 years old in the spring of 1990, the year she vanished from the side of a highway in broad daylight. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a warm smile that made conversations with her flow easily, even with people she had only just met. Her younger sister, Michelle, said Paige moved through the world lightly. She made friends without even trying. She would do people's hair and makeup simply because she enjoyed it. And she had a quirky sense of humor that could catch you off guard in the best possible way. At the time, Paige was working at an educational care center in Lansing while studying child development. She liked being around kids. She enjoyed structure, routines, and the small daily responsibilities that added up to something meaningful. She was also engaged to a man named Steve de Brabander, and together they were building a life in DeWitt Township, the quiet, simple kind of future that doesn't seem remarkable, until it's suddenly and tragically interrupted. On May 24, 1990, Paige's mother, Ardis, needed a ride to Detroit Metro Airport. She was flying to Atlanta to visit Paige's sister, Michelle, and Paige offered to take her. They left around 11:30 that morning. During the hour-and-a-half drive, mother and daughter talked the whole way, nothing serious, nothing out of the ordinary. After dropping Ardis off at the airport, Paige planned to meet a friend in Canton Township, about 30 miles southwest of the airport. It was a warm day, and she wasn't on a tight schedule, just a casual visit before heading home. Paige spent a couple of hours with her friend that afternoon. They walked through a local park, stopped for frozen yogurt at TCBY, and later visited another friend's house. By around 2:30 p.m., Paige said her goodbyes and headed back to her car. She began the drive home to Okemos, where she had a service appointment scheduled for 4:30 p.m. But before getting onto the freeway, she made one last stop, a party store on Ford Road, just west of Interstate 275. The woman working behind the counter would later become an important witness. She remembered Paige clearly, not because anything seemed wrong, but because Paige stood out. She was wearing loose, multicolored pants with a bold flower pattern, along with a long beaded necklace. The clerk complimented her on it. Paige bought a 40-ounce beer, poured some into a fast food cup, sealed the bottle, and then walked back out to her car. This was sometime between 2:30 and 2:45 that afternoon. From there, Paige merged onto Interstate 96 westbound and began the drive home. The trip from Canton to Okemos takes about an hour. For most of that drive, Paige would have been indistinguishable from everyone else on the road, just one car among thousands traveling Michigan's highways on a Thursday afternoon. No one had any reason to notice her, except that somewhere along that route, something went terribly wrong. Later, multiple witnesses reported seeing Paige's silver Oldsmobile on I-96. A couple of long-haul truck drivers recalled an attractive blonde woman behind the wheel, traveling west. One person even believed they might have seen her at a rest stop, although investigators were never able to confirm that sighting. What is known for certain is that Paige made it as far as Livingston County, roughly halfway through her drive home. And that's where the timeline begins to fracture. Sometime between 3:15 p.m. and at the latest 4:30 p.m., Paige pulled her car onto the shoulder of Interstate 96. The location was roughly a quarter of a mile east of the Fowlerville exit, close enough to the off-ramp that if she needed help, she could have reached a gas station or restaurant in under a minute. But instead, she stopped right there. There was nothing obviously wrong with the car. Later investigations confirmed there were no mechanical issues, the gas tank was full, and there was no visible damage. Nothing suggested an emergency that would have forced her to pull over. So why did she stop? And more importantly, where did she go? This is where witness accounts become both crucial and frustratingly incomplete. The people who saw Paige were passing by at highway speeds, 60, sometimes 70 miles an hour. They only had seconds to take in the scene, but several noticed something unusual enough that it stayed with them. Across multiple witness statements, one detail kept appearing: a maroon or burgundy minivan. Some witnesses said the van was parked in front of Paige's car. Others believed it was behind it, but most agreed it was stopped very close to her vehicle on the shoulder. And Paige wasn't alone. According to several reports, Paige was seen standing between the vehicles, speaking with two men near that burgundy minivan. One witness later recalled that Paige appeared to be gesturing with her hands, the way someone does when they're explaining something. One of the men had a hand resting on her shoulder. Nothing about the interaction looked frantic, and nothing appeared threatening. To anyone driving past, it likely looked like two people simply having a conversation on the side of the road. And that, more than anything, is what makes the moment so unsettling: the calmness of the scene. Now, one witness, an off-duty law enforcement officer, later said he came away with a very specific impression as he drove past. He remembered seeing a man standing near the front of Paige's silver Oldsmobile, his arm extended, as if he were showing her something in his hand. At the time, the officer assumed he was witnessing a traffic stop, that the man might be a plainclothes or off-duty officer displaying a badge. And that detail matters. Paige's father had worked in law enforcement, meaning she would have grown up with a clear understanding of police authority: to pull over when signaled, to comply, and not to question it. If someone had presented a badge to her, whether it was legitimate or not, there's little reason to believe she would have challenged it. There's another detail that deepens the mystery. When Paige pulled over, she removed her shoes. Investigators later found them on the floorboard near the driver's seat. Driving barefoot isn't unusual. Plenty of people do it. But leaving your car barefoot on a gravel shoulder, stepping away from your vehicle on the side of a busy freeway, without your purse and without your shoes in the middle of the afternoon, that's harder to explain. Unless she believed she was only stepping out briefly, perhaps to speak with someone she believed was a police officer. By around 6:00 p.m. that evening, a deputy from the Livingston County Sheriff's Department responded to reports of an abandoned vehicle along the interstate. When he arrived, Paige's Oldsmobile was still running. The headlights were on, and a rainstorm had recently moved through, so the windshield wipers were still sweeping back and forth. Inside the car, the deputy saw Paige's purse, her shoes, and the beer she had purchased earlier that afternoon. But at that moment, no missing person report had been filed. There were no obvious signs of a crime. So the situation was treated as what it appeared to be: an abandoned vehicle. The deputy shut off the engine, locked the doors, tagged the car for towing, and left the scene. No photographs were taken, nothing was handled the way a proper crime scene would have been. The exact location of the car wasn't even properly documented, which meant that when investigators later realized Paige was missing, that this wasn't simply an abandoned vehicle. Whatever potential evidence might have existed along that stretch of road was already gone. And that remains one of the most difficult realities of this case. From the very beginning, some mistakes could never be undone. At the same time, Paige's family had no idea anything was wrong. Her mother, Artis, was in Atlanta visiting Michelle. Paige's fiancé, Steve, was waiting for her to arrive at his softball game, assuming she was simply running late. Earlier that evening, the sheriff's department had left a voicemail at Artis's house saying they had located Paige's car on the side of the road. But Artis wasn't home to hear it. The message sat on the answering machine, unheard as the hours passed. It wasn't until later that the worry truly began. Paige hadn't called to say she had made it home, something she normally would have done. This was before cell phones, when staying connected meant landlines and answering machines, and silence carried much more weight. When neither Michelle nor Artis could reach her, they called Steve and asked him to check the messages at the house. That's when he heard the voicemail. That's when the day shifted from confusion to fear. Once the family realized this wasn't a delay, a misunderstanding, or a harmless mix-up, something was clearly very wrong. Steve contacted the DeWitt Township Police to report that his fiancée was missing. From there, the case was transferred to Livingston County, where her car had been found. By Saturday, investigators finally processed the Oldsmobile as a crime scene. Paige's fingerprints were already on record, not because she had committed a crime, but because fingerprints are often taken for things like employment background checks or licensing. This allowed investigators to easily eliminate her prints. Inside the vehicle, they discovered roughly 20 additional fingerprints scattered throughout the car that did not belong to Paige. They also found palm prints on the trunk, positioned in a way that suggested someone had been leaning against it. When those prints were run through law enforcement databases, nothing came back. Whoever they belonged to had no criminal record. In the weeks and months that followed, investigators pursued every lead they could find. The maroon minivan seen near Paige's car quickly became a central focus. Witnesses told police they saw Paige standing on the shoulder of the road, speaking with a man beside that van. The majority of witnesses, roughly 80%, described the man as black. Others believed he might have been Hispanic. Because the descriptions varied, investigators worked with police sketch artists, producing several composite drawings over the years. One sketch from the late 1990s depicted a smaller framed man. Years later, after hundreds of additional tips were received, the prevailing description shifted towards someone taller. But none of the sketches ever led to an arrest. The case attracted enormous public attention, not just because Paige disappeared, but because of where it happened, in the middle of the afternoon, on a heavily traveled highway, with witnesses who saw her standing there and assumed everything was fine. Over time, investigators received more than 200 tips. Every one of them was followed up. Searches were conducted across rural Livingston County using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Properties were examined. Fields and wooded areas were carefully combed. Then in 2011, investigators received something both intriguing and deeply unsettling. It was a hand-drawn map, sent anonymously. The map was detailed and carefully labeled, showing what appeared to be directions from the Interstate 96 exit to a nearby wooded area. It came with a cryptic note, suggesting the map might be a red herring, but claiming the sender had verified what they could. Investigators searched the area shown on the map, but once again, they found nothing. More years passed, and Paige's absence never softened for her family. Her mother, Artis, became a fierce advocate for missing persons, channeling her grief into action. She helped establish Michigan's annual Missing in Michigan conference and worked tirelessly to keep Paige's case visible, not only for her daughter, but for other families living with the same unanswered questions. In December of 2017, Artis passed away without ever learning what had happened to Paige. Over the years, investigators repeatedly examined and ruled out the people closest to her. Paige's fiancé, Steve, was cleared multiple times. He remained in contact with the family and continued cooperating with law enforcement. With no evidence pointing toward him, detectives were forced to look elsewhere. Eventually, that search expanded to men already known to police. Investigators considered several serial offenders who had been active in Michigan around the time Paige disappeared. One was Arthur Rees, a man with a documented history of violence stretching back decades, often targeting young women along roadways. Another was Gary Arzt, who was suspected of multiple killings across the state, though the full scope of his crimes has never been clearly established. And then there was Samuel Little, a name that didn't initially stand out. Years later, Little would confess to dozens of murders across the United States, including killings in Michigan during that same time period. Each of these men was investigated, but none could be definitively linked to Paige. With no physical evidence, no confirmed suspect, and no new leads, the case slowly went quiet. Not because it stopped mattering, but because there was nowhere left to push. Then, in 2025, 35 years after Paige disappeared, something new finally happened. Investigators in neighboring Washtenaw County made an arrest in a completely separate cold case. A man named Buster Robbins, now 69 years old, was charged with the murder of Beverly Wyville, a 30-year-old woman who had been killed back in September of 1989. At the time of her death, DNA evidence had been collected and preserved. Decades later, in 2024, that evidence was submitted for forensic genealogy testing. The results pointed directly to Robbins. As investigators began reviewing the details of Beverly Wyville's case, they noticed something difficult to ignore: the similarities between the two cases. Beverly had been sleeping in her car in Canton Township after dropping her son off at school. At some point, she was abducted from the vehicle, assaulted, and later shot. Her body was eventually discovered along Gottfredson Road in Superior Township, but what stood out most was what happened to her car. It was found later that same night back in Canton Township. The engine was still running, the driver's door was open, and her purse was still inside. When investigators placed the two cases side by side, the overlap was striking. Both women were 30 years old. Both cases involved Canton Township, and in both cases, the victim's vehicle was found running, with shoes and a purse left behind. Beverly was killed in September of 1989. Paige disappeared just 8.5 months later, in May of 1990. And there was one more detail investigators couldn't ignore. During that time period, Robbins was reportedly driving a vehicle that resembled an unmarked police car, a late-model Chrysler New Yorker. In Beverly Wyvil's case, a witness reported seeing a blue vehicle with a white top speeding away from the scene, matching that description. None of this proves what happened to Paige. But for the first time in decades, investigators had a name and a possible pattern that forced them to take another look. There was also another troubling detail. Court records show that Robbins had worked as a reserve police officer during that period. If he had access to a badge, even a reserve officer's badge, it raises a disturbing possibility. That kind of authority could explain how Paige might have been convinced to pull over in the first place. It brings investigators back to that off-duty officer who believed he saw someone displaying a badge on the shoulder of the highway. But this is also where the case becomes more complicated. Despite the DNA evidence linking Robbins to Beverly Wyvil's murder, a district court judge declined to send the case to trial in March of 2025. Robbins' attorneys argued that the DNA evidence only proves he had sexual contact with her, not that he killed her. The judge stated in court, "I believe there's more to this story." At the same time, the judge described Robbins as both dangerous and a flight risk, ordering him held on a $5 million bond. Prosecutors immediately appealed the decision. During those proceedings, prosecutors also referenced other investigations involving Robbins. These included allegations raised during divorce proceedings by his wife, describing coercive and non-consensual arrangements involving other men. Investigators also reported finding inappropriate and illegal material on a tablet belonging to Robbins. None of those allegations have been adjudicated in court, but together, investigators say they paint a deeply troubling picture of someone accused of long-term predatory behavior. For Paige's family, and for detectives who have lived with this case for decades, it raises the question once again, was this the man they'd been looking for all along? Setting aside everything surrounding Robbins, investigators continue to work Paige's case. Even with advances in forensic technology, there still isn't a clear answer. The fingerprints and palm prints recovered from Paige's car have been run through law enforcement databases multiple times over the years, always with the same result: no matches. And as for whether those prints match Robbins, those results have not been publicly released. If they do match, it could dramatically reshape the investigation. If they don't, it would raise an entirely new set of questions. For now, investigators say they are focused on three main theories about what may have happened that afternoon on Interstate 96. The first theory is that Paige knew the person who took her, but investigators say there is little evidence supporting that possibility. The odds of encountering someone she knew on a random stretch of interstate, someone with both the opportunity and intent to harm her, are considered extremely low. The second theory suggests a staged accident or request for help. Someone may have created a situation that caused Paige to pull over. But again, the evidence doesn't strongly support it. There was no damage to Paige's car, and witnesses didn't report any obvious mechanical trouble with the maroon minivan seen nearby. The third theory centers on authority. Investigators believe Paige may have been convinced to pull over by someone posing as a law enforcement officer. This explanation accounts for several details that otherwise don't make sense. Why did she stop just short of an exit instead of continuing somewhere safer? Why did she step out of the car barefoot? And why did she leave her purse behind? If Paige believed she was being stopped by police, compliance would have been instinctive. She wouldn't have questioned it. and she wouldn't have felt immediate danger. By the time she realized something was wrong, investigators believe it may have already been too late. For now, the connection to Buster Robbins remains under investigation. The similarities between Beverly Wivel's murder and Paige's disappearance are significant enough that detectives cannot ignore them. But similarities alone are not proof. For the first time in years, investigators have a lead they can actively test. And prosecutors continue fighting to bring Robbins to trial for Beverly Wivel's murder. The appeals process is ongoing. In the meantime, Robbins remains in custody on a $5 million bond, facing allegations that stretch back decades. Today, Paige Rinkowski would be 59 years old. She might have built a career, grown older alongside the people who loved her, and lived a life marked by the quiet moments we often take for granted. Instead, she exists in fragments: a photograph on a missing person poster, a case file in a sheriff's office. 35 years is a long time, but it is not long enough to stop searching for someone you love. If you have any information about Paige Rinkowski's disappearance, you are urged to contact the Livingston County Sheriff's Office at 517-546-2440 or email their cold case team. Even after more than 3 decades, one small detail could be the thing that finally brings answers home. Our thoughts are with Paige's loved ones, and we hope that one day they will finally learn the truth about what happened to her. Hey guys, just a quick interruption to ask you all a favor. If you could please hit that like button, it would really help me out a lot. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Now let's get back to these cases. For our second story, we travel to rural Minnesota. There is a very specific quality to darkness there. It's the kind of darkness most people rarely experience. No streetlights, no glow from nearby towns, and no ambient light pollution softening the edges. Just flat agricultural land stretching for miles in every direction beneath whatever mercy the moon might offer. On the night of May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home through that darkness along gravel back roads between the towns of Canby and Marshall. He had been celebrating the end of his freshman year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. He'd had a few drinks, and he was ready to get home. At 1:54 a.m., Brandon called his parents. His car was stuck in a ditch, and he needed help. He told them exactly where he believed he was, just off Highway 23 near the golf course outside the small town of Lind. But there was a problem. Brandon wasn't there at all. He was actually 25 miles away in the wrong direction, high-centered, on a minimum maintenance dirt road he should never have been on in the first place. For the next hour and 47 minutes, Brandon stayed on the phone with his father, Brian. They tried flashing their headlights across the darkness, hoping to spot each other, but they couldn't. Brandon grew frustrated. Eventually, he decided to leave his car and walk toward the lights he believed were coming from the town of Lind. His father began driving to meet him. Brandon walked through open fields in 39-degree weather, climbing over fences and navigating farmland in complete darkness. At one point, he told his father he could hear running water nearby. They kept talking while Brandon walked. A father and son, separated by darkness and distance, trying to find each other in the middle of the night. Then at exactly 3:10 a.m., in the middle of their conversation, Brandon suddenly interrupted himself. 2 words. "Oh shit," and then silence. Brian called out for his son. Nothing. He hung up and called back immediately. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. He called again and again, 5 more times. Brandon never answered. That was 16 years ago. Brandon Swanson has never been found. Not his body, not his clothing, not his phone, not even his glasses. Nothing. It's as if he simply stepped off the edge of the world and vanished. Brandon's life before that night, May 13, 2008, was the final day of classes at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota. For Brandon, it marked the completion of a 1-year program in wind energy technology. He had done well. His instructors described him as intelligent, focused, and academically successful. He was already planning his next step, transferring that fall to Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, more than 250 miles away, to continue studying science. Brandon was from Marshall, Minnesota, a town of around 13,000 people in the southwestern part of the state. It's classic rural Minnesota, flat farmland, quiet county roads, and small communities where most people know each other. Brandon had graduated from Marshall High School the year before and had spent the entire school year commuting the 35-minute drive to Canby. He was close with his family, his parents Brian and Annette, and his younger sister Jasmine. Friends described him as kind, curious, and big-hearted. He loved reading, debating ideas, and discussing history and politics. For 4 years, he had also worked part-time at a local grocery store, reliably showing up for his shifts. By all accounts, Brandon was a responsible young man with a bright future ahead of him. But there was one physical detail that would later become important. Brandon was legally blind in his left eye. He wore glasses to correct his vision, but depth perception could still be difficult, especially in darkness or uneven terrain. And on the night he disappeared, Brandon was reportedly wearing those glasses. Earlier that evening, he had stopped briefly at his parents' house. His mother, Annette, saw him before he left. Everything seemed completely normal. Later, she would remember their last exchange. "The things I normally say to him," she recalled. "See you later. Be safe." The night everything went wrong. Around 6:00 p.m., Brandon drove from Marshall to a small gathering in the nearby town of Lind, about 7 miles away. He spent a few hours there with several friends in someone's backyard. Witnesses described it as a relaxed and low-key gathering. Brandon had a few drinks, but no one believed he seemed intoxicated. Around 10:30 or 11:00 p.m., Brandon left Lind and drove back through Marshall. From there, he headed north on Highway 68 toward Canby, where another party was taking place. This was a larger celebration marking the end of the school year. The exact timeline becomes a little unclear here, as it often does with college parties. But Brandon arrived sometime around 10:30 p.m. Alcohol was present. One witness later said they saw Brandon take at least one shot of whiskey, but those who spoke with him described him as happy and social, not heavily impaired. No one seemed concerned about him. And Brandon didn't stay long. Sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., he left the party alone and began the drive home to Marshall. And this is where things started to go wrong. The direct route from Canby to Marshall is Highway 68, a paved highway Brandon had driven countless times during his year commuting to school. But that night, Brandon didn't take Highway 68. Instead, he drove onto the gravel back roads that run alongside it. These roads cut through farmland in a grid pattern, north, south, east, and west, intersecting at right angles across miles of empty countryside. If you know the area well, they're manageable, but if you're tired, if you've been drinking, if it's pitch black outside, and you're legally blind in one eye, it's very easy to become disoriented. At some point during the drive, Brandon made a wrong turn. And then another. And before long, he was heading west, the wrong direction entirely, back toward Canby instead of south toward Marshall. Eventually, he found himself on a minimum maintenance farm road. Not really a road at all, more like a dirt tractor path between two enormous crop fields. The fields had recently been tilled for planting. There were no houses, no lights, no landmarks, just darkness. At approximately 1:15 a.m., Brandon misjudged a turn. His green Chevy Lumina slid down into a shallow ditch. The incline left the car high-centered, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. He tried driving forward, then reverse. Nothing worked. He called a few friends for help, but it was late and no one answered. Finally, at 1:54 a.m., Brandon called his parents, and that call would become the last confirmed contact anyone ever had with him. Brian Swanson called out into the phone. "Brandon? Brandon?" Nothing, just silence on the other end of the line. He hung up and immediately called back. The phone rang and rang and rang. Then it went to voicemail. Brian tried again. The same thing. He called 5, maybe 6 more times. Brandon never picked up. By now it was after 3 a.m. Brian began driving up and down the gravel roads near the Linwood Tavern, searching in the darkness. He called his wife, Annette. Annette immediately started calling Brandon's friends, waking them up one by one and asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. Several of Brandon's friends quickly realized how serious the situation was. They got into their cars and began searching the countryside themselves. driving through the dark farmland looking for any sign of him. By 6:30 that morning, the sun was beginning to rise. Annette called the Lyon County Sheriff's Office to report Brandon missing. The response she received was deeply frustrating. Officers told her it wasn't unusual for a 19-year-old to stay out all night celebrating the end of classes. They explained they had procedures to follow. Brandon was legally an adult now, and at his age, one officer reportedly told her he had a right to be missing. Annette was horrified. Her son had called for help. He had been stranded somewhere in the cold, possibly injured. This wasn't a teenager out partying, this was an emergency. But the sheriff's office initially refused to act without waiting the standard 24 hours. Brian and Annette eventually had to go above local officers and contact the county sheriff directly before anyone would move forward. Finally, around noon that day, investigators contacted Brandon's cell phone provider. Phone records confirmed what Brian and Annette had been saying all along. There had been a late-night call for help, multiple calls between Brandon and his parents, but the records also revealed something shocking. Brandon had not been anywhere near Lind. The cell tower data placed him more than 25 miles away, somewhere between the small towns of Porter and Taunton, near the border between Lyon and Lincoln counties. Brandon had been completely and utterly lost. Armed with this information, deputies quickly located Brandon's car. It was sitting near the county line, stuck on a dirt-field road that was barely even a road at all. Lyon County Sheriff Eric Wallen later described the scene. There was nothing unusual about it. If someone happened to pass by, they would probably assume the car had simply broken down. Lincoln County Sheriff Jack Vizecki explained it further. The vehicle was stuck on the edge of a field approach. The incline wasn't dramatic, but it was steep enough that the car's wheels were lifted just high enough off the ground that they couldn't gain traction. Inside the car, everything looked normal. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no indication of foul play. Brandon had simply gotten out and walked away. The problem was figuring out which direction he had gone. The gravel roads left no footprints. The grassy ditches showed no clear path. And in an incredibly unfortunate coincidence, parts of the road had been freshly graded that very morning, covered with new gravel. Any tracks Brandon might have left may have already been erased. Searchers spread out across the farmland. An airplane circled overhead looking for clues. Friends and family walked slowly through the fields, calling Brandon's name. But they found nothing. The following day, search dog teams arrived from South Dakota and the Twin Cities. Handlers gave the dogs items of Brandon's clothing so they could pick up his scent. Most of the dogs struggled to find anything, but one dog, a bloodhound, locked onto a trail. The dog began moving south from Brandon's car, then turned west along the gravel road. After about half a mile, it entered a field near the driveway of an abandoned farm. From there, the scent trail appeared to follow the course of the Yellow Medicine River. In this area, the Yellow Medicine River isn't really a river. It's more like a winding creek that cuts through the farmland. But in mid-May, with spring runoff, the water was high and moving quickly. In some places it was only knee-deep. In others it dropped to 15 feet deep. At one point, the bloodhound suddenly jumped into the river. For a moment, searchers feared the worst. Maybe Brandon had fallen in. Maybe he had drowned. But then the dog climbed back out of the water on the opposite bank and continued moving, with what handlers described as good purpose of movement. The trail continued. The dog moved north through another field, following Brandon's scent for nearly 3 miles, before finally losing it just short of another gravel road. 3 miles. Brandon had walked 3 miles through farmland in total darkness. Lyon County Sheriff Joel Dahl later said the area around the Yellow Medicine River was the only place the search dogs showed consistent interest. Soon, investigators became convinced Brandon had somehow entered the water. Sheriff Vizecki personally walked 2 miles of riverbank every day for 30 days straight, searching for any sign of him. But he found nothing. As the days passed, the search for Brandon grew larger. Volunteers joined the effort. Teams with cadaver dogs searched the riverbanks for miles across both counties. But the dogs showed no interest, no indication of human remains. 2 weeks after Brandon disappeared, a massive coordinated search operation descended on the area. Search teams moved through the farmland on foot, on horseback and on ATVs. Low-flying aircraft scanned the fields from above. A former dive official volunteered to assist. The nonprofit Minnesota Search and Rescue Recovery Unit deployed additional teams. Specialized sonar equipment was used to scan the river. Everyone believed Brandon would be found. Sheriff Joel Dahl said at the time, "If I had to lay money on it, I'd say we're missing him somewhere in the water. Caught in an eddy, maybe held down by a log. He's got to be here." But he wasn't. Summer arrived. The water level dropped. Still, nothing. By the fall, once the crops had been harvested and the fields cleared, investigators brought in 10 cadaver dogs to search the open farmland. Again, nothing. No phone, no glasses, no keys, no clothing, no bones, nothing. Over the years that followed, the search continued. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. 45 highly trained search dogs from 9 different states were brought in. Tens of thousands of hours were spent walking through fields, ditches, streams, and riverbanks, but investigators kept encountering the same frustrating reality. There was no evidence. No evidence Brandon drowned. No evidence he died of hypothermia. No evidence he fell into a well or collapsed somewhere in the fields. No evidence of foul play. No evidence of anything. In 2010, Brandon's case was added to VICAP, the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. That decision raised a troubling question. Did federal investigators believe Brandon may have encountered a violent criminal? One detail in the VICAP release stood out. It stated that the doors of Brandon's car had been left open, not unlocked, open, physically ajar, multiple doors. That detail struck many investigators as unusual. Why would someone simply leave their car doors open in the middle of farmland and walk away? Had Brandon left them open himself, or had someone else opened them later? No one knows. And then there are the rumors. Small towns have long memories, and speculation often fills the gaps left by unanswered questions. Some people claim Brandon owed someone money. Others suggest there may have been an argument at one of the parties that night. A pipe was reportedly found inside Brandon's car, which led some to speculate about drugs. But there has never been any evidence Brandon had substance abuse problems. Friends say he appeared happy and normal that night, and investigators have repeatedly said they had no reason to believe Brandon was heavily impaired or involved in criminal activity. Still, the rumors persist, because when someone disappears without a trace, people search desperately for explanations. Any explanation. Brandon's mother, Annette, has long believed her son is no longer alive. She felt it from the very beginning. "Maybe I'm a terrible mother for saying this," she once said, "but before the first 24 hours were even over, I felt that something terribly wrong had happened." Even so, the Swanson family has never held a memorial service for Brandon. Every night they leave their porch light on, the same thing they did the night he disappeared, hoping he might see it and find his way home. "People don't just vanish into thin air," Annette once said. But in this case, it certainly seems like he did. The most haunting detail of Brandon's disappearance is how thoroughly he has been searched for. This wasn't a case where investigators gave up after a week. This wasn't a search that covered only a few square miles. More than 140 square miles have been systematically examined. 45 search dogs, thousands of miles walked, tens of thousands of volunteer hours, every inch of ground carefully documented with GPS. Search manager Jeff Hassey later described it as one of the most well-documented searches ever conducted. If Brandon's body was in that area, they should have found it, but they didn't, which leaves investigators with only a few possibilities. Perhaps Brandon somehow lies hidden in a place no one has searched, a location that has evaded 16 years of intensive investigation. Or perhaps he was carried much farther down the Yellow Medicine River than anyone believed possible. Another theory suggests someone encountered him that night and moved him somewhere else entirely. And then there's the final possibility that in those last seconds on the phone, when Brandon said the words, "Oh shit," something happened that left no trace at all. Brandon's father, Brian, still remembers that moment, the sudden sound of movement, and then nothing. Somewhere in western Minnesota, the answer to what happened to Brandon Swanson still exists. It has to, because people don't just vanish, except sometimes they do. Case information: Brandon Victor Swanson disappeared on May 14, 2008, near the border of Lyon and Lincoln counties in southwestern Minnesota. He was 19 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and weighed about 125 pounds. He had brown hair and blue eyes. He was last seen wearing blue jeans, a blue striped polo shirt, a black hoodie, and a white Minnesota Twins baseball cap. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and was legally blind in his left eye. His green Chevy Lumina was found high-centered in a ditch on a remote field road. His cell phone, glasses, and car keys have never been recovered. Brandon's disappearance ultimately led to the creation of Brandon's Law in Minnesota. The law now requires law enforcement to immediately investigate missing person reports when someone disappears under dangerous circumstances, regardless of age. If you have any information about Brandon Swanson's disappearance, you are urged to contact the Lyon County Sheriff's Office or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Even the smallest detail could finally bring answers to the Swanson family, and after all these years, they deserve the truth. On a cold February evening in 2004, along a quiet stretch of Route 112 in rural New Hampshire, a car crashed into a snowbank. When police arrived, the driver was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no trace of where she went. Just an empty road and a mystery that would grip the world for decades. More than 20 years later, people are still asking the same question. What happened to Maura Murray? This isn't just a missing person case. This is a disappearance that left behind more questions than answers, and a night where everything changed forever. Before the headlines, before the search parties, before the endless theories, there was just Maura, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Maura Murray was born on May 4, 1982, and grew up in Hanson, Massachusetts, the fourth of 5 children. Her father, Fred Murray, was a determined and driven man who pushed his children to succeed. And Maura did exactly that. She wasn't just a good student. She was exceptional, an honor student, a standout athlete at Whitman Hanson Regional High School, where she ran track and excelled in long-distance events. Teachers and coaches described her as focused, disciplined, and quietly intense. After high school, Maura achieved something many only dream of. She was accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point. Life at West Point is demanding, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And for a time, Maura thrived. But beneath the surface, something wasn't quite right. During her second year, she was caught stealing makeup from the campus commissary. It was a strange and out-of-character incident. Rather than face disciplinary action that could derail her future, Maura made a decision. She left West Point and transferred to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she began studying nursing. Was it just a mistake? Or was it the first sign that something deeper was beginning to unravel? A pattern begins to emerge. At UMass, Maura's life appeared to stabilize. She was in a long-term relationship with Bill Rausch, a fellow West Point cadet. She worked 2 part-time jobs, one at the campus security desk and another at an art gallery. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But once again, something didn't quite add up. In late 2003, Maura became involved in a credit card fraud incident, using a stolen card number to order food. Another sudden, unexplained act. Another break in an otherwise structured life. A pattern was starting to form. Achievement, followed by self-sabotage. But why? On February 5, 2004, while working at the campus security desk, Maura received a phone call. Minutes later, she broke down. Her supervisor described her as completely unresponsive, like she was almost in a trance. When asked what was wrong, Maura could only say 2 words, "My sister." But later, it was discovered that the call had not come from her sister at all. So what caused that reaction? Did she receive bad news? Or was it something else entirely? That same weekend, Maura's father Fred visited her. He said he was helping her look for a new car, but later some would question whether that visit and the behavior surrounding it was entirely normal. That Saturday night, Maura attended a party. On the way home, she crashed her father's Toyota Corolla, causing nearly $10,000 in damage. Fred was understanding, but the incident clearly shook her. By the morning of February 9, 2004, something had changed. Maura made a decision. At 9:15 a.m., She sent an email to her professors. She claimed there had been a death in the family and that she would be away for a week, but there had been no death. So why would Maura say that? Was it a cover story or something more personal? She began packing, not a lot though, just some essentials, in a single bag, clothes, toiletries, her UMass ID, and a few textbooks. But it didn't look like a short trip either. She withdrew $280 in cash from an ATM, nearly all the money in her account. She printed directions to Burlington, Vermont, and locations in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. She called a condo rental service in Bartlett. The call lasted 3 minutes, but no booking was made. She stopped at a cafe and ordered a sandwich and a coffee. Witnesses said she appeared calm, no panic or urgency, just quiet. Then she made one final stop. She purchased alcohol, a bottle of Bailey's, a bottle of Kahlua, a bottle of vodka, and a box of wine. More than most people would need alone. So was she planning on meeting someone, or simply trying to escape something? At some point that afternoon, her phone connected briefly to a tower near Amherst, and that would be the last signal ever recorded from her phone. No calls, no messages, just silence. Shortly after 7:15 p.m. on Route 112 near Haverhill, New Hampshire, Maura lost control of her car. Her Saturn slid into a snowbank along a sharp curve. No one saw the crash happen, only what came after. A local resident, Faith Westman, noticed the car and called out, but there was no response. She watched from her window as a man approached the vehicle, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood. He later said Maura was sitting inside the car. She was shaken, but conscious. He asked if she was okay. She told him she was fine, and then she said something strange. She told him she had already called 911, but there was a problem. There was no cell service in that area.
I just asked her how she was. She said she was shaken up. I couldn't see any blood on her face, and she was shaking like this. I says, okay, I'm going to go call the police.
Atwood left to call for help, and a short time later at 7:42 p.m., Officer Cecil Smith arrived at the scene. The car was there, damaged, abandoned. The airbags had deployed, and the windshield was cracked. Inside, there were signs of red liquid spilt across the floor. Later, it was identified as wine. But Maura was nowhere to be seen. There were no footprints leading away. No phone, wallet, no ID, nothing. By 8:15 p.m., police, deputies, and volunteer searchers began combing the surrounding area. They searched the woods, the roadside, the snowbanks, looking for any sign of her. But there was nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no blood, no indication of where she had gone. As the temperature dropped below freezing, the search was eventually suspended. It had become too dangerous to continue in the darkness, and when the sun rose the next morning, Maura's car was still there, empty. Did Maura leave willingly, or did she encounter someone that night, someone who made sure she would never be found? Why did she refuse help, yet leave her car behind? And most importantly, where did she go? Within minutes of the first 911 call on February 9th, 2004, local responders were already in the area. A neighbor and 2 officers began searching the snow-covered roadside along Route 112. But from the very beginning, critical time was lost, the time during which Maura may still have been alive. According to police reports, Officer Cecil Smith noted that the car was locked, the engine was cold, and no visible footprints were leading into the woods. But instead of immediately expanding the search area, officers focused on processing the scene. At the same time, a bloodhound picked up Maura's scent. It followed the trail for about 100 yards down the road before it came to a stop, completely. No tracks, and no disturbance in the snow, as if she had simply vanished. There was no full grid search that night, no aerial sweep until the following morning, and as temperatures dropped well below freezing, the opportunity to find her quickly began to slip away. By the next day, Fred Murray was already speaking out, frustrated and desperate, and convinced that urgency had been lost. He told reporters they treated her like property and not a person. While Law enforcement followed procedure. A father knew something was wrong, and he wasn't willing to wait. Fred began organizing his own search. Hundreds of volunteers arrived. Snowmobiles, ATVs, search teams were spread out across the White Mountain National Forest, but coordination between volunteers and police was minimal. At times, the two groups weren't even working from the same plan, and in a case like this, those early hours matter more than anything. Several potential clues emerged early on, but they didn't lead anywhere. At one point, a volunteer discovered what appeared to be a blood stain on a rock, but the police later dismissed it as rust. Witness interviews from that first night were handwritten, then later transcribed, raising concerns about accuracy during the most critical window of time. Some evidence logs were incomplete, and others reportedly went missing entirely. Piece by piece, the investigation began to fragment, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to rebuild what had been lost. Over the years, dozens of theories have emerged about what may have happened to Maura Murray, but most of them fall into three main possibilities: that she chose to disappear, that she died in the wilderness, or that she encountered someone who caused her harm. The first theory suggests that Maura may have planned her disappearance. On the surface, some of her actions seem to support this idea. She packed lightly, withdrew most of the money from her account, and printed directions to remote locations. To some, it looks like preparation, a quiet decision to leave her life behind. But the theory quickly begins to unravel under closer scrutiny. If Maura truly intended to disappear, why crash her car in such a remote location? Why leave behind belongings she might have needed? And perhaps most importantly, how could someone vanish so completely without leaving a single trace? There have been no confirmed sightings, no new identity, and no evidence that she successfully started over anywhere else. The second theory is that Maura wandered into the woods and succumbed to the elements. New Hampshire winters are unforgiving, and hypothermia can cause confusion, disorientation, and even irrational behavior. In some cases, victims remove their clothing or continue walking far beyond their limits. It's entirely possible that Maura left the road and traveled deeper into the wilderness than anyone expected. But again, there are problems. Despite years of extensive searching, on foot, by air, and with highly trained cadaver dogs, nothing has ever been found. No remains, no clothing, not even a single personal item. If she did die in those woods, she has remained completely hidden. The third and perhaps most chilling theory is that Maura encountered another person that night, someone who offered help, and then something went terribly wrong. There were reports of a red pickup truck in the area, and known offenders lived nearby. It raises the question, could someone have taken advantage of the situation? But once again, there is no physical evidence to support this. No DNA, no confirmed suspect, nothing that definitively proves foul play. And yet, despite the lack of evidence, many still believe this is the most likely explanation. Beyond the main theories, there are deeper questions that continue to linger. Why did Maura lie about a death in the family? Why did she leave without telling anyone where she was going? And who, if anyone, was she in contact with in the days leading up to her disappearance? There are indications that Maura had been communicating online with people investigators were never able to fully identify. This has led to speculation that she may have been planning to meet someone, but there is no proof, no confirmed messages, no digital trail, just possibilities and unanswered questions. Years later, the mystery grows. As the years passed, Maura's disappearance only became more mysterious. Her family refused to stop searching. Hundreds of missing person posters were distributed, and news coverage spread across New England. At the center of it all was her father, Fred, who continued to push for answers, refusing to let her case fade away. At one point, he made a simple emotional plea: "We're all here looking for you. Just call. We'll come get you." But no call ever came. It took 2 full days for Maura to officially be declared a missing person. 2 days in freezing February conditions where every hour mattered. In the absence of answers, rumors began to spread. There were reported sightings: a waitress in Vermont who believed she had seen Maura, a truck driver who claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker. Each lead was investigated carefully, and each one led nowhere. As time went on, the internet became deeply involved in Maura's story. Online forums, including web sleuths, are filled with theories, timelines, and debates. People began analyzing every detail, from the handling of the crash site to the early decisions made by investigators. Even Maura herself came under intense scrutiny. Every decision she made, every action she took, was examined again and again. In 2012, something strange appeared online. A video was uploaded to YouTube. The video was titled "Happy Anniversary." It shows a middle-aged man sitting in what appears to be a dimly lit basement, staring directly into the camera. And then, he starts laughing. Not a quick chuckle or a nervous laugh, but a slow, drawn-out, almost unsettling laugh that continues for over a minute. He doesn't look away, he doesn't speak, he just laughs. And then right at the end, he stops, gives a small wink to the camera, and the words "Happy Anniversary" appear on screen in pink text. The username attached to the video, 112 Dirtbag, immediately raised eyebrows. 112 appeared to reference Route 112, the exact road where Aura's car was found. And Dirtbag was a term her father had publicly used to describe the person he believed may have been responsible for her disappearance. The video spread quickly online. Some people believed it was nothing more than a cruel attempt to get attention. Others weren't so sure, and wondered if it was a taunt, or even a clue. Authorities eventually identified the man in the video as Alden Olson. After questioning him, they found no evidence linking him to Maura's disappearance. Olson claimed the video was simply intended to raise awareness about the case. Not long after it was uploaded, the video was taken down, and the account was deleted. But copies still exist. To this day, it remains one of the most unsettling moments connected to the case. In February 2014, on the 10th anniversary of Maura's disappearance, people gathered once again at the crash site. Family, friends, and even strangers came together, all connected by the same unanswered question. Fred Murray spoke to the press, reflecting on the years that had passed. A decade later, he was no closer to finding his daughter than he had been that night. But one thing had never changed. He refused to stop searching. Because with every passing year, the absence only grew heavier. False hope and dead ends. Over the years, there were moments when it felt like answers might finally come. One of the most significant leads involved an abandoned A-frame house near the crash site. Ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly beneath the basement floor, raising hope that Maura might finally be found. Investigators cut into the concrete and searched carefully beneath it, but once again, there was nothing. No remains, no evidence, just debris. Another lead, another dead end, and for her family, another heartbreak. As time passed, Maura's case reached a wider audience. A documentary series brought renewed attention and thousands of tips poured in. But none led to Maura. Investigators re-examined evidence using modern DNA technology. Remains found in the surrounding areas were repeatedly tested. Each time, the result was the same: no match. Meanwhile, online communities continued searching for answers. Some theories were thoughtful, others less so. But they all pointed to one truth: no one knows what happened. On February 9th, 2024, 20 years after Maura disappeared, memorials were held in her honor. People gathered to remember a young woman frozen in time, 21 years old, forever. Fred Murray, now in his 70s, spoke again, his voice quieter but still full of love. "If Maura is out there, I love her. If she's gone, I'll see her on the other side." Across the region, blue ribbons were tied to trees. Small symbols of hope. A reminder that she has not been forgotten. The case today. As of 2025, Maura Murray's case remains open. There have been no confirmed sightings, no arrests, no closure. Authorities say the investigation is still active, but after more than 2 decades, what does active really mean? In recent years, investigators revisited evidence from Maura's car, including a CD case that contained a fingerprint which had gone unidentified for years. Eventually, it was matched to someone connected to Maura's past at West Point. When questioned, he explained the print as an innocent transfer from years earlier and denied ever being in her car. So far, there has been no confirmed evidence placing him at the scene. But even small developments like this raise new questions, because in a case like Maura's, every detail matters, After all these years, we are still left with the same possibilities. Did Maura choose to leave? Did she lose her way in the woods? Or did she encounter someone that night who changed everything? We live in a world that demands answers. We want every mystery to be solved. But some disappearances don't follow those rules. Some leave behind nothing but silence. No evidence, no closure, just absence. Somewhere the truth about what happened to Maura Murray still exists. It has to, because people don't just vanish. Except, sometimes they do. If you have any information, you are urged to contact the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Even the smallest detail could finally bring answers, and after all these years, Maura Murray remains out there somewhere, a mystery still waiting to be solved, and I truly hope her family one day get the answers they so desperately need. And that brings us to the end of tonight's cases. 3 people, 3 stories, and 3 lives that seem to have simply vanished without a trace. Cases like these remind us that not every mystery gets solved, and sometimes the truth stays hidden, just out of reach. If you've made it this far, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Which case stayed with you the most? And if you enjoy true crime told in the dark, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me again for more stories that linger long after the lights go out. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, some people disappear, but the truth is always out there, waiting to be found.